Did penis size around the world increase in length by almost a quarter during the past 29 years? 2 weeks ago, a meta-analysis was published suggesting just that. Researchers from Stanford University, from the universities in Milan and Rome in Italy, and Atlanta gathered data from a total of 55,761 men. The measurements were taken during a period covering over 60 years, from 1940 to 2021. The other day, I received a comment from Panther's Rule, who asked me about my thoughts on this study. If you are new to UroChannel and want to understand why he asked me, please check out my playlist on penis size around the world, which I will link at the end of this video. So thank you, Panther's Rule, for the inspiration to this video. But before we start, I want to warn you that it's going to be a tough video because I will present to you an in-depth analysis which may be difficult to follow for some of you. But I will do my very best to make it as digestible as possible. In the end, I will present to you my opinion, so try to hang on as long as possible. First of all, there is one thing you will have to understand about meta-analyses. The data stems from research other people did and published. So the guys from Stanford didn't literally measure all of those men themselves as proposed by some news channels on the internet. Overall, they did an impressive job in filtering out 8,022 studies from the literature, which they broke down to 172 studies from which they distilled 75 studies fitting their eligibility criteria. In their analysis, they looked at decade, region of the world, and type of study subjects, like if they were volunteers or patients, etc. With their study, they wanted to answer the question, has penile length changed over time globally? The answer was yes regarding erect length, but neither flaccid nor stretched length. Their result was that erect penile length has increased globally by 24% between 1992 and 2021. In numbers, this is from 12.27 centimeters equaling 4.8 inches to 15.23 centimeters equaling 6.0 inches. Now let's dive right into the study and have a closer look. For studies to be included into the analysis, penis size had to be measured by an investigator. The sample had to include at least 10 men, they had to be at least 17 years old, and the studies had to provide sample size, mean and standard deviation of flaccid or erect length, measured from the root of the penis to the tip of the penis on the dorsal, that is the upper side. If articles reported self-measurement or measurements after major pelvic surgery, they were excluded. I did not look at all of the studies that eventually made it into the analysis, but I drew some more or less random samples here and there, and some of the articles I had already used for penis around the world. One of the oldest studies they included were the Kinsey data from 1948. When I looked up the reference, I found this. Definitely no data on 2,578 men. I think they wanted to refer to this book from 1948, but used the wrong reference. Maybe. But anyhow, the Kinsey data on penile dimensions are self-reported. They shouldn't have been included in the first place, because, as you might remember, self-measurement was a no-go for this meta-analysis. I happened to have a copy of the 2014 study by Hebernick and colleagues on 1,661 men living in the United States. That study was also included, although the results are based on self-measurement at home. Furthermore, the measures seemed to have been obtained by measuring the ventral side of the penis, because in the article it says that men were instructed to measure from the underside base. So neither this study should have been included because it contains two exclusion criteria. A big Italian study with 4,685 men was included. Even here, this is mostly self-measurement. The study subjects were instructed how to measure and then took the measurements themselves. I cite from the study. Most men measured their penis while alone, using hand stimulation to become erect. Also, this study should have been excluded because it violates the inclusion criteria for the meta-analysis. The study by Bogart and Hirschberger is also based on self-reported measurements. These 3,228 men should also have been excluded from the meta-analysis. There were 2 Korean studies included by Park and co-workers, both with the same reference number and reference, but in fact, only one study was from 2011, while the other one had been performed in 1998. It says that the measurement method was not listed. Unfortunately, the article was not freely available, so I only could look at the abstract. But already in the abstract, it briefly describes how the measurements were performed. Furthermore, they assessed both erect and flaccid length, and not only erect length as stated in the meta-analysis. I mean, this is just minor stuff, but together with including studies that should have been excluded, it leaves an overall impression of sloppiness regarding the scientific diligence. And as I said, I just quickly checked some of the random samples from the database. The sample size of the meta-analysis is misleading regarding the key finding. Yes, they looked at over 55,000 men, but when it comes to erect size, only 20 studies out of the 75 reported erect length. For this subgroup, the sample size was considerably smaller, 18,108 men. If we just exclude the patients which shouldn't have been included in the first place, the sample size shrinks down to 8,534 men, and maybe even smaller because, once again, I didn't check all of the references. When it comes to the actual numbers, I'm confused. 20 studies analyzing erect length had measurements ranging from 9.50 centimeters to 16.78 centimeters, it says, which translates into 3.7 to 6.6 inches. So the minimum was 9.5 centimeters and the longest penis 16.78 centimeters? I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find any other explanation like a 95% confidence interval for these numbers. 16.78 centimeters is rather small because there are outliers. I am talking about men with very large penises, 18 centimeters equaling 7 inches in the Italian study, and 26 centimeters equaling 10.2 inches in one of the US studies. When it comes to the 24% increase in length during the past 29 years, I get even more confused. Now, I am not a statistician and I don't know how to calculate a meta-regression model, but I'm not stupid either. There is no comprehensible explanation how they came up with an erect length of 12.27 centimeters for the year 1992 and 15.23 centimeters for 2021. I mean, from 4.8 inches to 6.0 inches? If you just look at this table and focus on erect length of the last decade, the mean erect length is 14.55 centimeters and 95% of all men have sizes between 13.86 to 15.23 centimeters. Wait a minute, 15.23 centimeters? Wasn't that the new standard? That's not possible because 15.23 centimeters is at the upper end of the 95% confidence interval. That means only 2.5% of all the men have longer penises. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. That's not possible, especially when looking at the numbers from the other decades. There is no significant difference here. And where does this strikingly small number of 4.8 inches baseline comes from? So overall, my opinion is very interesting analysis with lots of data included, but it is a study of rather low scientific quality. I don't think there is a rise of 24% in penile length over the last 29 years, especially not with unchanged flaccid and stretched results. Yes, it is possible that flaccid and stretched measurements are not reliable, but then why weren't they excluded for analysis in the first place? Another possible explanation for the rise could be an incorrect calculation. Another possibility might be connected to porn. But I think since 90% of you have left the video already, I will talk about this in another video. In the meantime, please watch all episodes from Penis Around the World. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.